Great. Well, thanks a lot. It's a great privilege to be here. I came to South Africa 5 years ago on the invitation of the CSIR, and out of that came this initial development of the South Africa PyPSA model by Joanne Kalitz, who's in the room with you, and Jonas Hirsch. So I'm very glad to be back again in touch with you folks. And what I do is I just give a very quick overview of why openness, talk a bit about PyPSA and some examples from our user base, what we're trying to do with PyPSA, and then wrap up. And I will really try to be done in 20 minutes because you may have specific things you want to discuss, and you can maybe pick things out from the talk. So I'll do this quite quickly, but energy is obviously very high social, political, and economic relevance. There's a lot of business interests. There's lots of, especially in Europe, we have hundreds of billions of euros spent each year on energy. It's obviously extremely hot issue right now with the current gas crisis and nuclear crisis. We have a lot of uncertainties about the future, even more than we thought we had. We used to have uncertainties just about technology costs, but now geopolitics is a big one. There are many trade-offs that we have to make over the next 30 years as we decarbonize the system. It's not just about cost. We've been a bit too much focused on cost, but there are also trade-offs with acceptance and political support and land usage. We need to do computer modeling to avoid bad investments, but that is very open to manipulation because the results are often strongly driven by the inputs and the assumptions. So that's why we think openness is very important. Openness really means that anybody is free to download the software, the data, the results, inspect it, process it, share it with others, modify it, and redistribute it. And this is typically done by uploading the model to an online platform with an open license, which tells the users what they can do with the model. And here you can see we kind of want the whole pipeline to be open, the data that goes in, the software that processes it, and the results. Why is this a good thing? Well, it increases transparency. It allows other people to reproduce the results. We don't want these black boxes determining hundreds of billions of energy spending. It reduces the duplication of effort. In Germany, we have 100 research institutes, each with their own model. That's a massive waste of resources. Let's pool our resources on common models and leave that time to develop new ideas. What we often see as a motivation for open source is also the high level of customizability. If you're using Plexos, it can be a bit intransparent what Plexos is doing in the background, and it's not as easy to customize as open source, where you can actually go and see what the equations are and what the code is doing. We've seen it also enables new actors to participate in the debate. We've seen increasingly NGOs in Europe using open source software, and this quality aspect, people look at the code, they can give feedback, and I think that's also important. It also helps with collaboration, and I hope that as these models become used and distributed among stakeholders, it can help with public acceptance. There's some common objections to open modeling. I'm going to skip over that, but they're there in the slides, and I'll share the slides later. So there are quite a lot of open models now, actually. We don't really need more open modeling frameworks. On the page of the Openmod initiative, we have 80 models, and then there's probably an undercount by some fraction. So there were some early models before 2010, but there was a big boom in the last 10 years or so because of this interest in greenhouse gas reduction and the demands of renewables integration, which requires finer grain modeling. And these are used not just in academia, but also in companies and NGOs and research institutes. And we'll see a few examples in a second. For me, actually, I think there's enough modeling frameworks out there that we don't really need any more. What really is a bit of a problem now is getting good quality, high validated data sets, because otherwise your modeling is really restricted by how good the input data is. And it's quite hard work collecting these data sets, especially at high spatial resolution. So this is one of the challenges I see in the open space world right now, is getting good quality and open data. There's also an initiative, it's a grassroots initiative called Openmod, the Open Energy Modeling Initiative, which brings together modelers from universities, research institutes, and the interested public. We have nearly 1,000 members from all continents except Antarctica, and it's very informal. There's no membership requirements, but there is a mailing list, a forum, and a wiki for basically exchanging about open energy modeling. So please check that out if you haven't come across it already. So I'll give you a quick overview of our modeling framework, Python for power system analysis. This is an open source tool for high resolution power system and energy system modeling. We developed this 7 years ago, really to bridge the gap between power flow software like Power Factory or Map Power from the open space and energy system modeling software like Plexos, Times, and Osmosis. We believe it's important to bridge this gap because we see an increasingly important role for good grid modeling because of this variability in space and time of the renewables. You need detailed modeling to understand how to integrate renewables and also electrify those other sectors of the economy, transport, heating, and industry that are not yet electrified. So we developed this 7 years ago with this goal to try and bridge this gap, and there wasn't anything quite like it at the time. So that was sort of our motivation for developing it, and we wanted to do it openly so that other people could use the tools as well. So it's to summarize the capabilities, it's a capacity expansion model with you can also run it for market modeling, and it is used for market modeling. It's also used for adequacy assessment, resource adequacy assessment scenarios as well. And you can also run power flow on it as well. So of those categories that we had there at the beginning that Grover had on the screen, what we don't do is transients. So we don't do dynamic differential equation modeling, but we do static or quasi-static nonlinear power flow. And there are components in there for power networks, both AC and DC. We have generators with unit commitment, our variable renewable generators with time series behind them, storage and conversion, and the whole nexus of power to X, so power to mobility, heat, and gas that we need when we look at decarbonizing the full energy sector. On the back end, we're using other open source libraries wherever possible. So we have Pandas for data analysis, our optimization framework we've actually built ourselves to maximize the performance. Sometimes we were having performance problems there, and so we've actually engineered our own optimization framework, and we interface to the major solvers like Gurobi, Cplex, and Express because they have dedicated algorithms for solving these kind of problems. It's been used for greenfield analysis, brownfield analysis, and also pathway planning. So you can also put in different investment years from 2020 to 2050 and look how the system evolves over that time period. It's highly customizable, and that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people find it attractive. So we have a lot of users at this point across the world. This is a pretty old map, actually. I think we should refresh this. But we have a lot of research institutes, a lot of companies, a lot of NGOs more recently. So just to name a few, in Europe, there's a lot of research institutes there. Companies, we've had transmission system operators, Transnet BV. We've had companies like Shell and Saudi Aramco using it for various analyses. We've had increasingly non-governmental organizations like Agora and Energiewende in Germany, Ember in the UK, Instrat in Poland, and Terry in India using it for their various analyses. And we try and keep a list of users linked here as well, but I'm not sure it's complete because we don't always know who's doing what with the software. So here's a few examples of what people have been using it for. So the transmission system operator Transnet BV that owns and operates the transmission network in southwest Germany, they used it to model the future energy system in 2050 to try and understand what kind of requirements there would be for grid operators coming down the line. So they modeled various different scenarios, including a net zero scenario for 2030 and net zero for 2050, and then back to 2030 to understand how the system would be changing. And if you talk to them, the reason why they chose this open source solution was they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. They could take an existing model that was highly customizable. And again, when you talk to Plexos users, so Plexos being one of the main commercial competitors of PyPSA, one of the main benefits they find is that it's transparent. It doesn't have strange numerical behavior that they can't explain. When there's a problem, they can see in the code exactly what's going on and go in and modify the equations. So transparency and customizability is a really big motivating factor. Similarly, in this study of the Indian power system for 2030, this was done by the Energy and Resource Institute in New Delhi. They were trying to model how renewables could be integrated given the large, very inflexible coal fleet that they have in India. So they were using the unit commitment part of PyPSA to see how batteries could help integrate more renewables given the legacy thermal coal fleet there. And the reason why they were interested in PyPSA again was this easy customizability compared to Plexos, and also it was very good for building up skills among the various stakeholders in India. They could distribute the model to lots of people, and then they could get comfortable with the modeling. Ember is an NGO based in the UK, and they've recently used PyPSA for I think it was around 10 node model of the UK to model a gas phase out. The UK has already essentially had a coal phase out, although I think in 2022, because of the gas crisis, they maybe see a bit more coal, but they've had a coal phase out, and they're now interested in the gas phase out. So they modeled a gas phase out by 2030 using the code, and have released that report, and according to them, had some political influence in the Labour Party with the results. The Rocky Mountain Institute's been using it for synthetic fuel production costs modeling. So this is something that we see increasingly the users using, is not just looking at the power sector, but also looking at other sectors, in particular the production of synthetic fuels, which may also be interesting in the South African context. So I don't know actually whether they did model South Africa in this exercise, but they were certainly looking in Australia, the Middle East, and in South America. Max will tell a little bit about the PyPSA Meets Earth initiative a bit later. What I'll tell you a bit about is what we're trying to use the model for. We're trying to use the model really principally to look at this full sector decarbonization, but we don't just look at the power sector. We also include the gas sector, possible repurposing of the gas infrastructure for hydrogen, the carbon dioxide cycling that we're going to need if we're capturing from point sources and using some of that carbon, for example, in synthetic fuel production, and also looking at all of those demand sectors that could be electrified. So we have the various building heating modules, transportation demand, and all of the industry sectors broken down into steel, cement, other metallic minerals, paper and pulp, and so on. So we're trying to really now look at the full economy decarbonization with all those various pathways and intermediate energy carriers, networks and storage, and the various different primary resources you can see on the left-hand side. We want to do that at high resolution so we can really see trade-offs between building the electricity grid, maybe repurposing the natural gas grid for hydrogen, and the role that carbon dioxide circularity might play in the economy. And the reason why we need to do this at high resolution is that we have real problems in Europe building new grid infrastructure, and that means we have a lot of grid bottlenecks in the system, and we need to take those grid bottlenecks into account in the modeling because they have a big influence on where we can build the wind and solar and how much flexibility we then need to cope with those grid bottlenecks. So this involves a lot of data. We have our grid model, which we have to cluster down to around 200 nodes for Europe to make it possible to even optimize. We have all of our power plants assumptions going in, our availabilities of renewable potentials and our various time series. And we try and do that in a really open way so that you have a pipeline that takes this raw data and transfers that through the modeling all the way to the results outputs. So I'll show you a few results from this modeling, and then I'll actually wrap up so that we have lots of time for discussion. So we've taken this model, we put all of the energy sectors in there. We put constraints on the model that we go from today's emissions all the way down to net zero by 2050. We have these small bidding zone regions, which are smaller than the current bidding zones in the European market. And then we look at the effects of what happens when we restrict the power grid expansion, for example, when we allow a new hydrogen grid, or when we have this trade-offs with e-fuel imports from outside. Because once you start looking at the industry sector, there's also a bit of a trade-off there. How much of it do we actually want to keep in Europe, and how much can we replace by importing either hydrogen or secondary products like ammonia, methanol, hot briquetted iron? That could actually be a pathway to decarbonize these sectors rather than keeping some of them in Europe. So it's some of the issues that's really relevant in the current policy debate in Europe, especially with the very, very high fossil fuel prices that we're experiencing right now. So we can do this, we can do capacity expansion at high resolution, including all of these sectors. Here's a couple of results when we allow a lot of grid expansion. What you see here on the left-hand side is grid expansion of the original alternating current power grid in gray and an HVDC network that's overlaid on top in purple. And you see the various investments the model's making in wind in blue, solar in yellow, and the various flexibility assets like batteries and power to gas that can then be re-electrified in fuel cells, for example. This has a consequence for the gas network. Here you can see a possible hydrogen network that could be built up to bring hydrogen from those electrolysis centers you see here in purple through to the load centers where people are consuming hydrogen in the steel industry, possibly also with some heavy trucking, and also for re-electrification for those periods when there isn't that much wind or solar during the winter. And because we have this in the monolithic model, we can then put restrictions in, we can restrict the amount of grid expansion, we can go all the way down to no grid expansion, and that will then force more flexibility to be built in the system. And you see here, when we don't have any grid expansion on the left-hand side, then we have a significant build out of the hydrogen grid on the right-hand side. And we can sort of sweep through all these different possibilities. We have computer clusters, so we can throw lots of resources at these problems and look what happens all the way from no grid expansion down to optimal grid expansion and see this sweep of solutions. Because typically what we see is around the optimum, so you can see the total systems costs here broken down into different categories, and the true optimum would involve a lot of grid expansion, but this is quite a flat optimization space. The costs only really escalate when you don't have any grid expansion, and you actually get most of the benefit with a small amount of grid expansion that already reduces the costs by 50 billion, which is a big saving, and is half actually the total benefit available from the grid at the optimum of 100 billion. And this is one of the lessons that we see, is that you shouldn't always just focus on the optimum of the system. You should look at the whole space, because there could be many attractive near optimal spaces that are low cost but may have other benefits like higher public acceptance or less land use or a more equitable distribution of production capacity around the country. So we've been experimenting a lot with hydrogen and hydrogen infrastructure recently. We've been trying to see how robust the hydrogen infrastructure is. We've been trying removing the hydrogen network and seeing what benefit that really brings. And typically we're talking benefits of 30 to 50 billion in the European context, which is around 4 or 5% of the total spending on energy. We've also been looking at repurposing natural gas infrastructure as hydrogen. Just to show you a few examples here, this is the total amount of energy grids that's being constructed. And we can see some part of that is actually hydrogen network that's been retrofitted from the old fossil gas infrastructure, and we can compare that then to what's required for the power grid. We've also been looking at how the infrastructure changes if we have significant amount of imports from outside of Europe. So we assumed for some of these scenarios that Europe was a self-sufficient system, but we could also have significant imports of ammonia, of methanol, of perhaps also hydrogen from outside, and that also has a very strong effect on the system. Depending on how much is imported from outside, we could see slightly different results. So with around a third of the total energy consumption being imported from low carbon e-fuels, it reduces the costs in Europe by around 7% versus a more self-sufficient scenario. And this is this trade-off between security and resilience and cost here that we have in the European discussion right now. We've also tried to work on the visualization of the results. We have an online version of the European model, which you can go in and set your own assumptions, and it will calculate what the optimal system looks like, and then you can change the assumptions. Here's an example where we allow much cheaper nuclear to be built, and you'll see trade-offs there between renewables and nuclear, which is often a question that comes up, especially in social media. Why aren't we considering, why isn't there more nuclear being built right now? And that really is dependent on the assumptions that you put in the model, and that can be shown here in the example. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I hope I've convinced you that openness and transparency are important in the modeling, that reusability and customizability is very important, and it allows very swift policy response. When you have these openly accepted models in the space, then people can quickly calculate, recalculate scenarios and react in a fast way to the changing circumstances we see in the energy sphere. Openness really means making your data and code available under open licenses. Open energy modeling is now widely accepted across academia, government, NGOs, and industry. I don't think this was the case 5 years ago. There wasn't so much usage among industry and NGOs then, but I think that's really changed. We're seeing transmission system operators, energy supply companies, everybody piling in and using these tools. I think they're very useful for understanding these trade-offs, as we've seen in a couple of European examples, also for looking for these near optimal solutions that may be interesting from an acceptance or an equity perspective. And I think this openness is very, very important with all these tricky topics coming down the road. There's decarbonization, obviously. There's difficult discussions in Europe about how much e-fuel import we want to allow and whether our industry is going to, our energy intensive industry is going to relocate abroad. There's difficult discussions about carbon management that are just starting in Europe, and I think openness there really, really helps. So I think I was within the 20 minutes just about. Sorry, it was a bit of a whirlwind, and I'm very happy to take any questions. I can see in the